I'm here with Darren David from Stimulant. We're doing Perspectives with Phenom Blue. Darren, why don't you tell everybody about kind of your role and a little bit about the business?
Sure. So I started Stimulant in 2007, and it was really born out of an interest in exploring new ways for people to interact with digital content in the context of physical space. So we kind of burn ourselves out on web dev and rich internet apps, and we saw a bunch of new interesting technologies coming out around multi-touch and the like. And really kind of just decided to take the plunge. We thought that would be interesting. It was in a pre-smartphone world, so there were a lot of commonly accepted interaction paradigms that we have today that didn't exist back then. So there was kind of a long uphill battle and a lot of learning curves because there were no best practices for what we did. So we started doing really a lot of R&D and prototyping in that sense. Evolved into doing a lot more permanent installations, what we call smart spaces. So basically physical environments that are augmented with properties. And that's kind of the core of our work right now. So we work with architects, experienced designers, experiential marketers, and we kind of help bring a lot of these sort of digital ideas to life in a physical space. Give people experiences they can't get at home or on a device.
And so that space has picked up quite a bit the last 5 years specifically. And I know that you can't go anywhere without seeing data or some sort of technology visualized in sort of those interactive, highly interactive sort of experiences. So how has strategy sort of like started to become a part of what you're doing as far as trying to help solve business goals or goals of the client, that it's not just doing something really cool, but also sort of adding some value?
Well, it's an interesting question because there really still is I think there's a big question mark around what the value is of doing these experiences. Mostly clients come to us because they want differentiation. They want to try and reach people with something they haven't seen before. They want to snap them out of their day-to-day. They want to present their message or their content in a way that kind of knocks people out of their routine, and that's a good way to get your message across rather than trying to fight through a sea of online advertising or mobile content. So that's a big part of it, and I think really what we're dealing with is less of ROI, return on investment, but ROA, return on attention. Kind of in an attention-based economy is the way that we look at it. So we realize that with these experiences, sometimes you only have a split second to get people to notice, and so we're designing experiences for a half-second glance to a 15 to 30-second interaction, and that's our window. So it's really finding ways to reward attention, essentially, and that's kind of where strategy comes in. It's thinking less about how am I going to get money back on that, and more about how do we really create engagement and then measure that and feed that back in so that we know that we're actually being effective.
So how do you measure that when you guys are doing those things?
Well, a lot of it really is observational. Right, is watching how people react.
Right.
Are people having a positive reaction? We joke about a metric, smiles per hour. Right. Are we actually getting people to stop and say, "Hey, you got to come see this thing"?
Yeah.
We actually build analytics into all our systems, so very much like web analytics, but with a lot of advanced sensors now, we can actually measure presence. We can measure gaze. Whether people are actually looking at something and for how long. So a lot of that we're feeding back into just a regular analytics dashboard so that we can actually see what kind of engagement we're getting.
That's interesting. So how do you think that sort of the measurement you're getting from gaze and all that kind of stuff, does that influence the creative on the front side of it? Or is that sort of an afterthought?
I'll tell you what, I think it's less about influencing the creative and more about influencing how we actually build the systems. So, instead of these being linear, very fixed experiences, everything is totally data-driven and very parameterized. So what we're actually able to do is take a look at this data in real time and actually fine-tune the way the experience works, without having to rewrite the software.
Right.
So we might change a timeout, we might change the order that things are presented in, we might change, some of the way that interface elements, react to people, and so we're actually able to kind of dial it in, so it becomes much more of sort of a living performance, if you will, and we feed that data back into the system, and maybe we measure it for a month and we'll do it, but if it's a trade show, we might actually be tweaking things hourly or daily to fine tune it. So I think that's really how we're using the analytics. I don't think we're at a point yet where we could actually trust the analytics enough to just feed them back into the system,
right,
and assume that everything will work. So there's still a lot of I think that's where the strategy comes in. It's less about influencing the creative and more about building systems that we have to assume we aren't necessarily going to get it right the first time, and that we have to kind of dial it in over time.
Huh, that's interesting. So who's your client when you're not naming a client, but who's your person inside the client? Is it a marketer? Is it an advertiser? Is it the CEO? Who are you talking to when you're working with these projects?
When we first started doing this stuff, it really was the technical team. We would get a call from an IT department, a CTO or a CIO, or we get a call from the folks like, hey, we're remodeling the lobby. Can you come and do something? And we'd have to stop and say, well, what's the narrative? What's the message? What are your goals and the success metrics? What are we trying to get across here? And at some point, that has to funnel into a CMO or someone like that who's responsible for messaging. But ultimately, it rolls up to, in a lot of these instances, because these are significant investments, it rolls up to the CEO, right? There are business goals, and they're having to involve this team in terms of actually making sure that the goals are met. So we're starting to see a lot more of the marketing team get involved, because we're looking to them and saying, what is the brand? What is the message? How do you want to measure this stuff? Who is your audience? And often, a lot of times, we're helping them discover that for the first time. They may have it figured out online. They may have it figured out, say, if they're a retailer in brick and mortar, but they don't necessarily have, say, the brand or what they're trying to get across figured out in this smart space world, that physical digital hybrid. So we're often asked to extend the brand into things like, what are the micro interactions and what do transitions look like that are brand right, and those kinds of things that are much more environmental and less purely digital or
and sort of those in the weeds things that they're not thinking about, right?
Yeah. So I think that's where we add a lot of value.
Yeah.
And I think that's also where we get a lot of people to freak out when they realize that this isn't the kind of thing you can just half-ass. These are usually significant investments, because you're having to do something that's not only rooted in physical reality. So there's a lot of construction involved. Hardware is often not cheap, and really these are custom software experiences. These aren't sort of hey, I'm just buying a product and licensing it and bolting it onto a wall. It's something that's very much integrated into an environment, and that takes a lot of effort to get right.
So what kind of things do you think, if you're talking to a client, what sort of makes you, what kind of client, from a personality standpoint, a perspective standpoint, resources, what makes a good client? How do you do your best work? What sort of things do they do well to enable you to be able to do your job?
I think a good client is someone who is approaching this with open eyes, and is willing to listen. And we are the same way too. We don't propose to be, experts in their business. So we want to help them learn from what we know about best practices, and they need to help us learn their business. And it's really much more conversational. I think it's that people understand, the value of what they're getting, and really it's our job to help manage expectations. I think when we started doing this, there weren't a lot of people doing this kind of work, and us included. We had to sort of bootstrap and learn a lot about how to do these things and do them well, and understand what resonates and what doesn't. Now I think that there's a lot more of this content out there. People are building an experience and shooting it, and the video goes viral, and clients will send us a video and say, we want one of these. This is the right answer. We're like, well, actually, this is something that can only happen at night, and it could only live for a day, versus your budget, and you want this to be permanent, and it has to work, in noontime outside.
Right.
So let's take a step back and really understand your business goals. What are you trying to get from this? What does success look like? Maybe this isn't the right solution, but you want to do something physical and digital. Let's do that together. And so I think it's clients who are willing to kind of let go of what they think the solution should be, and be a little bit more open to, figuring strategy out in a collaborative way.
So tell me about real quick, maybe like a war story about your project that didn't go the right way, for reasons where you weren't able to do what you needed to do.
Well, okay. So we had one project where, for better or worse, the idea was born out of a CEO going to a competitor's location saying, they've got one of these cool things.
Right.
We want one now too. So, they brought in the IT team, not the marketing team. Those were kind of run under very different folks, and this whole thing had to come together in, I think, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, right? It was an arbitrary deadline. the CEO just said, I want this done by this date. Is there any reason? No, it has to be done by this date. So it was rushed to begin with. But as soon as the brand team got involved, we were building a generative system, where it's software based and it's driven by interaction. It's not really preset, but brand was so unfamiliar with that concept that we had to take a system that we had developed that was completely freeform and algorithmic based and force it into layout rules that followed their new brand system, they were developing as we were building the system.
Jeez.
So we're writing all of this extra code to make things look a certain way. And the week we launched it, they threw out everything they had been doing with the brand and said, well, we've changed everything. I'm like, well, this is what you're getting. So, I think it's one of those things, again, where the client wasn't willing to kind of jive and say, what's the right solution?
Yeah.
It was very much, well, we know yes, we agree that your solution, we like your approach, but we have to control every facet of it.
Well, a great strategy is not, our competitor has that and I want one of those. Those usually don't tend out to work very well.
Turns out.
Yeah, and clients won't stick around long enough to see those things even, you know what I mean? They're willing to just go on a whim because there's no strategy to begin with. So obviously, we're in Cannes and it's super hot outside, and luckily we're underneath a tree.
Not for long.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you're speaking tomorrow, right? And you're speaking with David Schwartz. So what are you guys talking about, and sort of what do you hope people leave your session sort of taking away, or if they leave and they go home, what are they taking away?
Well, it's an interesting talk actually. It's called
Don't ruin your talk. Just
okay.
Yeah, okay.
It's called The Rise of Smart Spaces, and it's us. It's David Schwartz from Hush and Jake Barton from Local Projects, and it's moderated by Leslie Bradshaw from Made by Many. And I think what's interesting is that we all have very different perspectives on what smart means in a space. And I think that's great which means there's a variety of approaches to what is still a very nascent field. Mm-hmm. And I think, for the audience, the value that we're bringing is marketers and advertisers and brands and institutions are looking now at this medium as a way to really separate themselves and create something new and memorable that, again, like I said, doesn't get kind of lost in the shuffle. Mm-hmm. Because it's such a small segment, the more that we can all start to have these conversations, the sooner we can all agree on best practices. Because one of the issues about, experiences that people have never run into before is if they don't get it immediately, right, then you've lost them.
Yeah.
And so, it's kind of back in the 90s when Flash came out, and everyone was like, yay, we all get to make our own scroll bars, and there were 200 different ways you could scroll content, which was great for developers and differentiation and terrible for end users, right? You have to learn an interface every time you see it, you've kind of failed already.
Yeah.
So, I think more it's forcing us to all have this discussion about what are the right ways to engage people in space, what are the right ways to merge brand and content with these environments and ways to pull them off where we know we're going to get that reward on attention.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you spending some time, man. I know you're busy, so I'll let you back to the conference.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Cheers.